Doctors, please be seated.
Members of the graduating class, your parents, other relatives, faculty, and friends. And from the size of the house tonight, this morning, I'll get that right eventually. From the size of the house this morning, you have a lot of friends. It's a real pleasure to welcome so many people to this occasion. It is one big family gathering, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you here this morning. And I want to extend my particular congratulations to those of you who are graduating today. At this point in the program, it is my pleasant responsibility to introduce the speaker of the morning. Mr. Sperling was born in Long Beach, California, but he grew up in the Midwest in Urbana, Illinois. He is a graduate of the University of Illinois with a BS in journalism, and he is also a graduate of the law school at the University of Oklahoma. He is a member of the Oklahoma, Illinois, and Massachusetts bars. Mr. Sperling joined the staff of the Christian Science Monitor in 1946, following 5 years of service as an officer in the United States Air Force during World War II. He was the chief of the Midwest Bureau of the Monitor from 1957 to 1962, chief of the New York Bureau from 1962 to 1965, and assistant chief and news manager of the Washington Bureau from 1965 to 1973. He became the chief of the Washington Bureau in 1973, a position which he currently holds. Mr. Sperling is the founder of the Breakfast with Godfrey, a group of prominent Washington newsmen whose breakfast meetings serve as forums for questioning the leading governmental and political personalities of the day. Newsweek, in an article on what it terms breakfast with Budge, this happens to be Mr. Sperling's nickname, but Newsweek, in an article on what it terms breakfast with Budge, has this to say about his breakfast, which reached a total of 762 on February 8, 1977. I quote from Newsweek now. By now, the breakfasts have attained such a prestigious status that even the Washington Post anti-establishment critic, Nicholas von Hoffman, concedes grudgingly that they are considered invaluable to political writers. And Theodore H. White, in The Making of the President, describes the group as what he calls a closed inner circle of political reporters who link together as one of the prime transmission belts of political opinion. The New York Times calls the Sperling Group a prolific news-generating institution that has spotlighted many national figures while remaining anonymous itself. As White House correspondent for the Monitor, Mr. Sperling accompanied President Ford to Tokyo, Seoul, and the summit with Brezhnev in Vladivostok in late 1974, to the NATO meetings in Brussels in the spring of 1975, and to Peking in the winter of 1975. Mr. Sperling has covered presidential campaigns and elections since the early 1950s. During this last year, he provided on-the-scene coverage of every major primary of both conventions and the fall campaign. His honors and his accomplishments are too numerous to attempt to list in a short introduction, short as this. So let me conclude my remarks by saying that it is my great pleasure to introduce to you now our distinguished speaker of the morning, Mr. Godfrey Sperling, Jr., who will speak on the topic, the educated person and government. Mr. Sperling.
Thank you, Dr. Parks, for those very generous words. President Parks, distinguished guests, members of the faculty, parents, friends, and finally, and most important, the graduating class of 1977. Good morning. As we will never forget, Franklin D. Roosevelt once said that all we had to fear was fear itself. Now, a top White House aide mentioned this FDR quote to me the other day and said the President felt that what we had to fear today was also something akin to fear, the mental attitude underlying the widespread public distrust in government. The President does not equate his early popularity with a real breakthrough against this public anxiety, wariness, apathy, and even fear directed toward government and government leaders since Vietnam and Watergate. He knows that every day he is working against this undercurrent or latent undercurrent of distrust in government and government leaders at every level, and particularly in the presidency and Congress. Now, can he get a turned-off public to go along with him? That's what he's testing with his energy program, or at least with parts of his energy program. Can he sustain this rather tentative and personalized public support beyond the early months, beyond the honeymoon period? He simply doesn't know. So he woos and courts and pats the public in an effort to hold them with him, but always knowing that he must be continually talking, cajoling, and showing that he has nothing up his sleeve. Now, as Dr. Parks has said, I am a political reporter. Over the years, I have been traveling up and down the country, developing contacts and keeping in close touch with people who understand their localities and are conversant with their friends and what their friends and neighbors are saying and thinking. And from these sources, which I am continually tapping, I must conclude that this tide of unrest and distrust still is running strong, and among the very same people, strangely enough, who say they like the President and who helped give him this very high popularity rating, which still is holding high. But so don't make the mistake of equating Mr. Carter's popularity with unshakable trust from the public. Many, many citizens who like the President's folksy ways and willingness to talk to them are not ready to go to the well with him if the going gets tough. And the President is quite aware of this. Now, my findings show that people generally are just fed up. And that means liberals as well as conservatives, and those in the middle of the road, too. They feel that all kinds of forces, government and private, are pushing them around, shaping their lives. So in a sense, the movie Network was right. You may have seen the movie Network. But I don't think that people would react in the way that movie depicted, responding to the urgings of a mad TV announcer to rush to open a window and shout out angrily, "I'm fed up." For one, Americans just aren't that angry, not in my opinion. Frustrated, yes, at taxes, at corruption in government, and at all kinds of pressures and strains in their own private lives, compounded by inflation, which once again seems to be on the verge of getting completely out of hand. But there is a countercurrent at work, too. People generally know that they are better off financially than they have ever been. Or if there's been a falling off from that peak, it really hasn't been too much. So the inner conflict within Americans, most Americans, I believe, is one of a feeling of well-being, fighting against this feeling of frustration. But the end result is an attitude that is highly suspicious of those who apply pressures, and particularly of the government, since it is an easily identifiable enemy. However, I don't think the people, fed up as they are, would pay any attention to a TV announcer who pleaded with them to give vent to their unhappiness in this way. Certainly, television does have immense influence on its viewers, but I also say that my soundings show that people certainly and generally don't find much credibility in the media and very little in television. And polls support my findings on this. In fact, I would say that the most persistent and therefore the most credible finding is how unbelieving the American public has become in just about everything. It seems that they would believe their garbage man before they would believe the media, or even before they would believe their doctor or their lawyer, and on and on. Now, this is not to speak of the low credibility rating that government officials get from the public. Congress, especially since it took that big pay hike, rests down near the bottom of such credibility ratings. Somehow, I don't know how, but the fact that the President gave the executive branch a similar raise, almost as much, escaped the notice of most of those I've talked with. But all government, the executive and judicial, as well as the congressional, stands very low in public esteem. Now, is government deserving of the public distrust it now is receiving? Vietnam naturally made countless unbelievers, and so did Watergate. But the new War Powers Act should curb war-making excesses of an unwise president, and the ethical climate in government in cities, states, and the federal government had been improving vastly through the years. And now, in the wake of Watergate and congressional scandals, there is evidence that new laws and codes will put the moral tone in Washington once again on the upgrade. Perhaps, of course, we have purified the CIA even too much. You know, there's a real question whether an essentially secret operation can function effectively with as much exposure as it is now getting. But, by and large, I approve of the purifying. The CIA had gone too far. Times had changed. It was time for new criteria and for an effective oversight mechanism. But beyond the obvious, I think there is another and very persistent reason for this public distrust, and particularly for that which focuses on government and continues in the face of improved moral conduct and tougher restrictions against misconduct. Now, perhaps by some of those here, I will be accused of oversimplifying, but I will risk it. For I suggest that education may be partially responsible for, or at least heavily involved in the public disinterest in and skepticism about government and government leaders that is so evident today, especially on the college campuses. Now, when our founding fathers set up our government, there were many astute observers of the period who said it simply wouldn't work. It was much too complex, not sufficiently precise, and it contained that great imponderable, rule by the people. However, de Tocqueville, in his travels in the 1830s, found that the American people felt that they could make this complicated government work simply by producing a nation of educated Americans, where education would be for everyone, and a nation made up of such people would and could make our complicated government function. They put their bets on education and on the educated person for solving problems facing our nation. There was to be universal education, and this was to bring in the millennium, or something close to the millennium. Well, education has taken us far. I don't have to recite the conquest of science both here and out among the stars, and I don't have to mention the obvious, how science has taken us close to the brink of disaster, the nuclear threat, and our environmental plight, compounded by scientifically produced refuse. Education has brought books with their wonderful vistas of thinking and learning within everyone's reach, and this has added immeasurably to the happiness, not just of a few, but of anyone who would reach out mentally Also, the educated person has brought his skills to government and has made even bigger governmental organization more efficient than it otherwise would have been. Furthermore, the more educated electorate not only comprehends the intricacies of government's workings and is better able to cope with it, but it also tends to make heavier and heavier demands on government for improved performance. And under such demands, and with more skillful, educated people to work in government, more efficiency and effectiveness have now been achieved, although bigness and bureaucracy have choked some of this. Also, the ethical climate has improved. This may be difficult to believe, but it has improved. Just look back at Harding and Teapot Dome, and before that at the days of Grant and the earlier Jackson period. We may even remember Daniel Webster's acceptance of bribes. But this more educated public somehow has felt there has not been much, or certainly not enough, progress toward cleaner and better government, even though its own attentiveness and demands have been instrumental in bringing such progress about, including the post-Watergate cleansing in Washington. And now, in the wake of Vietnam and Watergate, this same more educated public, or at least a public that is widely exposed to the educational process that has made government more effective by its vigilance and prodding, is no longer fulfilling the hopes of our forefathers. This more educated public, or at least it appears that much of it, is turned off by government and thus is making government and what could very well be effective government less effective, less likely of success because of its own distrust in and its own unwillingness to support the system and those who run it. Now, I know that my point lies in nuances, but what I'm saying is this: a more alert, more vigilant public arising out of a society in which education has been within the reach of just about everybody has been a positive influence on our government. But this public interest in government has now soured, particularly on the college campuses where the thought leaders there and produced there have had such a strong and positive influence on government. And the apathy and the disinterest that one finds, I contend, can be a drag on our country. Now, perhaps this is putting too much of a burden on education, or better, on the process of learning to which the public is exposed. But if public trust in leadership and government is lacking or dropping off in a world in which education for all is a reality, then it certainly has not fulfilled the expectations of our forefathers that de Tocqueville cited years ago. Now, I am just recently returned from a week as a visiting fellow at a Midwest university in which I observed the student and faculty apathy about government firsthand. I found full classes in which none had watched or listened to any of the president's 4 TV appearances about his energy plans. These speeches all given within a period of 8 days. A political science professor at that university echoed the assessment I got from several members of the faculty there. The students here are turned off, he told me. They think it really doesn't make too much difference who is president. We'll be getting the same old thing. So they don't pay much attention to what the president is doing. They don't pay much attention to what the president is saying. They just study hard and hope they do well enough to get a job after they graduate. Now, my answer to all this is not one of despair, and I certainly would not settle for public ignorance. Instead, my faith lies in my conviction, my hope, my trust that this is a transitional period. We are so very young as a nation. The questioning of our institution was so very important. The explosive involvement of young people, particularly on our college campuses, was marked by remarkable accomplishments, like pulling a great nation back out of a war and convincing a whole generation of adults that our civilization has become too materialist. But with mounting frustration stemming from a widespread feeling that government doesn't respond, government doesn't work, we are now immersed in this widespread apathy and distrust. This turned-off phase is not good, but I do think it is temporary and to be followed by a society that will once more be supportive of its government and its leaders. But never uncritically so, never blindly so. Now, where does education fit into this next phase? I definitely feel that the theory de Tocqueville observed in the early days of our country holds true today, that our hope still lies in education for each individual, the best he can accept, the best he can use. I see education playing an important, a vital role in leading us to a stronger society, but I must confess to you that I don't know precisely how. But without being certain how education will do the job, I would just like to suggest that it should contain some of the following guidelines or objectives. It should lead students, and through them, the people as a whole, toward a more sophisticated understanding of our government. It should define our government better in terms of what it can do and what it cannot do, so that the students and public generally don't have inflated and even impossible expectations of what government can accomplish. College and education generally should still foster idealism, by all means. But I would venture to suggest, that students will need to learn to look more to themselves as individuals and to their own individual responsibility of becoming involved in running the nation if government is to work and if government is to work better. Now, over the years, I've carried on a very very unscientific study. When talking to parents in an informal setting, I ask this question: what do you want your child to do when he grows up? I will get varying answers. Doctor, lawyer, it's up to him or her, and so on. Then I ask, would you like him or her to go into politics when he grows up? And then comes the unvarying answer: I wouldn't want my child to go into politics because politics is dirty. I really didn't have to say that, did I? You were already there before me, I'm sure. It's such an obvious answer. And actually, the answer is so obvious that I hesitate to repeat it. But if politics is dirty, we need good people to go into it and clean it up. The educated person of tomorrow, in my opinion, should be more aware of his responsibility to vote, and he should vote. We must somehow break this deplorable decline in voting. You know, we reached a record percentage low in our last presidential election. There was all this talk about record voting, but actually there was a record low in percentage of voting in our country. It keeps going down. And as I have already indicated, more and more of the brightest and most politically and governmentally talented of our educated people should actually participate in campaigns and government. They should help others get elected, and some should run for public office themselves. Since Vietnam and Watergate, our political leaders all over the country, in every region, are having great difficulty in getting good people to be willing to run for public office. And this must be changed, and you out there can change it. Now let me sum up my message in this way. It was the perception of the young that changed the thinking of our country about war. And it was a couple of comparative youngsters who cracked open Watergate and showed what had been going wrong in the government itself. Don't abandon ship just as you are winning. The young got this job going. How about finishing it? Well, not reforming the whole of society, but completing this particular cycle or wave of reform, and then staying in to run it better and see that it is run in the most effective way possible. You can't help society, you know, by copping out. Just when some real accomplishment is in sight, and just because you can't get the millennium overnight, the government was your adversary, or many of you felt that way about it not too many years ago. But now it's your agent, trying against heavy odds and inertia to do something of what the great protest movement wanted. Why join the inertia at this critical moment? A push might get us over an important hump and build on the serious concerns on what the earlier generation of students did. So it won't be remembered for the excesses and bombings and burnings of the extremists, but for the intuitively valid and helpful criticism of our society by the great mass of the young of that period. Now, a one-time high official under Franklin D. Roosevelt once wrote in my newspaper, the Christian Science Monitor, that it never gives up the ship. Well, I think that's a fair statement of my newspaper. I think it's true. And I would hope that I don't give up the ship either. And in this vein, and to paraphrase Franklin D. Roosevelt, I would say to you today, the only thing we have to fear today is discouragement. So keep your hope. It will encourage others, and it will be giving your support to a nation that can only function if your hopes, your prayers, and your trust, the public's interest and basic backing, is there. This nation and its government, with all its faults, is entitled to such interest and trust, and it cannot prosper without it. So keep your faith in this nation, not blindly, finding fault when necessary, making suggestions, getting angry too if there are blunders or excesses, but never giving up the ship. The ship can't stay afloat without you. Here I would like to cite a wry, rather humorous quip that the humorist Art Buchwald used in a commencement address that he made a few years ago, right in the midst of the Vietnam War. Turmoil all around. He looked out at the student audience and he quipped, "We have given you," he said, "now we have given you a good world. Don't louse it up." Well, my final message to you today is not a quip, not a humorous, very straight, very serious. Come back, you out there. We need you. You can indeed make it into a better world. Thank you.